All right, we are going to get started.
Last one.
It's our last week together. No, it makes me so sad. No, this is our last week. I think that one of the main things that Marie and I have learned in the midst of these 7 weeks is that it really needed to be like 12 weeks.
Yeah. Even as an overview.
Yeah, even
no,
as
seven's
even
good
as
because
an
it's just an overview.
No. Yeah, no, it wasn't enough. So, okay, so today we are wrapping up the book of Leviticus. So I want to start by saying, like, how many of you have now fully read the whole book of Leviticus? So proud. So proud of you guys. Yeah, that's okay. I mean, if you're like, you haven't quite finished, but you were planning on it, I'm so proud. Me too. So,
you enjoy it.
Well, that's a good question. How many of so new insights, hopefully, that have made it much more interesting and enjoyable and maybe slightly easier to read than before. So, okay, so before we get started, let's open in a word of prayer. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come today and to gather and to study your word, and for the past 7 weeks that we have been able to dive into your word with one another and to read and study and look at a book that I know for me, I didn't really want to like open. But I am excited about this book and excited about learning more about you, and I think that's true for all of us. And so we thank you for this time that you have given to us to really study. And so today, as we kind of wrap up, would you just continue to be with us and speak to us and through us? And we pray all this in your holy name. Amen. Okay, so today we're going to talk about parties. Right? Awesome. Parties. And so I have a handout for you. I felt like one of the easiest ways to kind of get through the information of the festivals is to kind of create a handout that you can have. So it'll be like your cheat sheet of Israelite festival stuff. So I'm going to give you some information that's in your handout, but also your handout has some other information that I may not cover. So this gives you a lot of information. Now, I will say this about the book of Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, when we read about the festivals, it's really not comprehensive information about the festivals. Really, the more comprehensive information about what's supposed to be done at the festivals every day and things like that is much more found within the book of Numbers and then some within the book of Deuteronomy. So Leviticus really kind of gives an overview of the Israelite festival times. So if you want to know more about each festival, I've given you the other references on your sheet. So if you'd like to kind of go and read more information, more detailed information. The reason in general that the festivals are listed within the book of Leviticus is because obviously celebrating the festival times is part of God's law given to the people. This is part of what God is asking the people to do in regard to continuing to live a holy life. There are a few things that we need to know and recognize before we kind of dive into this information. The first is that God has instituted these specific days to help the people remember their story, to remember their role, and to remember their God, that they are set apart, and that God has created very specific times of rest and worship. So these are obviously outside of the normal kind of days and the normal rest period of Sabbath. But one of the other things that's really important to understand about the festival times is that it is centered in an understanding of Sabbath. So you need to, as an Israelite, really know the importance of Sabbath rest on a weekly basis before you can really enter into and fully understand what God is doing in regard to the festival times, because everything is centered around the understanding of Sabbath rest. And one of the things about that is just as God had restored creation, as he rested in creation, he asked his people to rest and dwell with him. So one of the things about festivals is the festivals mark the calendar of the Israelites. And it is marked within harvest time as well. And it's different from our calendar. I mean, it's set in a lunar phase. So I think it was brought up a week or two ago about the fact that the next Day of Atonement Day, which I am like blank on that, what it's called, starts on like a Wednesday or something. So for us, it's unusual to think that it's not started on a Sabbath, but it's all based upon kind of lunar. But that does not mean that the regular Sabbath is not to still be worshipped and done the same way. So this is all, the other thing is it's all kind of grounded in creation theology. There's an ebb and a flow to God's creation as a whole. And so harvest is part of that creation ebb and flow. And so rest that God is calling the people to, and worship and relaxation and focus on him also comes in kind of a flow like creation. Okay. So some other things that we need to know is that there was a word used often in chapter 23 called holy convocation. That's what I had in my within my Bible. I don't know if it was called something different in someone else's, but I'm pretty sure it's holy convocation within every interpretation.
Sacred assembly.
Sacred assembly, yes, same kind of thing. So it occurs 11 times within chapter 23. It literally means a call or summons or reading. So the idea of a holy convocation is a national public calling to the tabernacle for worship. So anytime you see sacred, what was it?
Sacred assembly.
Sacred assembly or holy convocation, that's what it means. So in every festival time, it's not necessarily a festival time that you worship in your house. It's a festival time where the people of God as a whole need to come together and worship alongside one another, because we're a unit, a family, the people of God. So it brings us together. Now later on, within the New Testament, part of that holy convocation and that call to gather together will also be considered a pilgrimage. So when the people get into the land and they have their portions of the land, they're much more separated than when they're in the desert. And so to come to the main space, which is Jerusalem, where the temple is, not only do you come for festival, but you come as a pilgrimage to the festival. But you are still called as much as possible to try to get to the central place of the tabernacle with as many of the rest of the people of God as you can. Now, everybody couldn't necessarily make every pilgrimage for every festival, but you tried to make at least one. And we know a story of Mary and Joseph who come for a very specific festival. They were pilgrimaging for a festival. So, okay. That's important for us to know. Also, one of the other things is this, while the priest has a huge role in regard to festivals, it is the laity's responsibility, and largely this is addressed to the laity, of this is what you are to keep. It is your responsibility to know the festival times, to prepare for the festival times, and to participate in the festival times. It's not just the priest's role, it is your role as well. So everyone has a particular role and a particular call in regard to festivals. It doesn't all fall just upon the priest's shoulders. Okay. I already told you each festival marks a beginning or an end of harvest time, and we'll talk in a little more detail about each one. Most of these festivals, you would hopefully read that God says, when you get into the land, this is what you will do, this festival time. So majority of these festivals, while they were in the exile in the desert, they did not participate in because they couldn't have participated in them. There's only so much harvest you can bring when you're living in the desert trying to grow anything you possibly can, which was not easy. So a lot of this is prescribed to be done once they take the land. Now, the only two that were excluded from that was Passover and the Day of Atonement. Those two were practiced regularly while they were still in the desert. The other festival times were to be held off until they take the land and live in it and harvest it and things like that. So in some senses, we're reading like the future information of what should be happening. There's a few other words we need to define. There was one that said, in my Bible, it said no ordinary work. Some of you may have also had yours that said do not work at your occupation. And then there may also be some other ones. That literally means just no heavy work. So it's like a regular day of Sabbath. You just don't do you don't do your job. You don't farm, you don't trade, all that kind of stuff. There's a distinction that needs to be made here because there are a few festivals where it is said that you need to Sabbath with solemn rest or complete rest. That's different from Sabbathing with no ordinary work. So no ordinary work is you just don't do your job. Sabbathing with complete solemn rest covers none of your heavy work plus no minor household chores such as cooking or fire making or anything like that. That does not happen very often. It only pretty much happens on the Day of Atonement, and I think there's one other one which we'll probably get to. Because of the intent of Day of Atonement, you're supposed to set yourself to affliction, if we remember from when we talked about atonement 2 weeks ago. That means that day is so set aside that your focus should be so much on God that you don't have any time or energy to be doing anything else. So we don't even do anything like light a fire. Now, we do know that much later on, the priests have taken this solemn rest to an extreme, and they kind of yell at Jesus about a few of these things, right? So they've misinterpreted ordinary rest and solemn rest at a later date, and they get mad at Jesus for Jesus' disciples for like picking some fruit off a tree or something. Oh, it's the Sabbath and all that kind of stuff. They've mixed these two, and they've become very, very, very legalistic about it. The solemn rest was very particular, was not used very often, but it was definitely a time where you didn't do anything else but focus on God. An ordinary day of rest was just you didn't do your job. You didn't do your regular occupational job. You rested so that you could be with God. See the difference between the two? Okay. We also ran into a thing called a sheaf and elevation offerings. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Basically, a sheaf was considered most of the time to be a stick or stalk of barley because that was the first thing that was harvested. It took the less time to grow, and so it was harvested first. An elevation offering is essentially just an offering that you elevate to God. So when they raise the sheaf and when they raise the bread and they call it an elevation offering, it's just because it's elevated and kind of offered to God. Yes?
We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So let's look at each festival in a little bit more detail. And we'll start with the Passover and unleavened bread. So as you'll see, the festival of Passover and unleavened bread and really the festival of first fruits all go together. And they kind of run right into each other. So they're really kind of a huge set. They happen in what's considered for the Israelite calendar to be in the first month. This marks the first month for them, which is kind of different for us. It happens in about March or April. it matters depending on kind of the moon phases. So there's no real definitive day of when it starts. It's just, depending on that. So Passover, obviously we know Passover is the day that the people of God are to remember that God has brought them out of slavery. the night of the Passover, the preparation time, the time when they slaughtered the lamb and put the blood on the doorpost, and prepared and were ready for when God called them out to leave. So this is significant. This is one of the reasons that it was continuously celebrated and remembered even within the desert, because one of the things that God asks of his people over and over and over again is that we remember all that he has done. Because the fact is that we are a people who are not very good at remembering. So he put something in place, a moment in time to remember all of what God has done. So that is happens on the 14th day at twilight. So we do it that night. We have a big meal. There's lots of things that go along with it. But ultimately is the retelling of the story of what God has done. And as time goes on, a little bit more gets added to that story. But that is what Passover is. The next thing that happens, which is marked by the next day, is the Festival of Unleavened Bread. And the Festival of Unleavened Bread is a celebration where we offer the first things of the harvest, essentially. So unleavened bread is also a remembering time of when the people had to leave Egypt with the bread. They prepared it the night before, no leaven because it keeps longer. So again, we're continuing to tell the story. And it is marked with a day of rest. From there, we get to the Feast of the First Fruits. It is kind of as soon as the Festival of Unleavened Bread ends, the Festival of First Fruits begins. So this is a nice party time. Israel is to bring their offerings of their first fruits of the harvest to the priest, and that is most likely the sheaf of barley because it is harvested before wheat. Wheat comes just a little bit later. So you offer barley. So part of this is remembering the fact that God gets the first and the best because God is the one that provided any of it. So this is also kind of one of those things that's an allusion to tithe as well, that you give the first and the top and the best to God, and then you take. And even in the time of the first fruits, it says that as a community, you cannot take of the harvest for yourself until you have brought your first fruits to the priest so that he can offer it to God. Some of those first fruits go to the priests, and the priests, the rest of all of the Levites. So that's one of the other reasons that it's important. It helps make the bread that we will talk about, the bread and the oil that we will talk about later in chapter 24. So they're offerings and important to continue moving the temple forward and the presence of God to dwell within the temple. So this is why the first fruits is so important. There's also tons of other things that you bring alongside it. It says that you bring a male lamb with no blemish. There's a grain offering, a food offering, a drink offering of wine. So it is a significant time. It is more offerings than a regular day offering because of the significance that it is. Now, if you'll see, I have just drawn some correlations within those first three festivals on your paper about Christ. Because the Passover, if you'll remember, was what Jesus celebrated with his disciples the night that he was betrayed. He did that before they went to the garden. So there's this, for me, there's just this beautiful line of how God has lined everything up. It's the Passover night, celebrating and remembering the fact that the people of God were in slavery, needed to be saved from slavery by God, and there was preparation for it, but there also had to be a sacrifice. So that night, Jesus celebrates this with his disciples, and that night is also the night that he is arrested and prepared to be the sacrifice. Then we move into the next day, which is the festival of unleavened bread. And that's the day that Jesus gives his life for us. And then in the midst of that is when Jesus rises again. And these celebration days that are so important to the people of God is when Jesus gives his life. The beauty of how God has planned that and followed through on all of that. So the people of God, if you're a good Israelite, you get the amount of significance that's happening, not just in the festival time, but what Jesus is doing at that time. It's powerful. Now, obviously, some Israelites didn't get it until later, but hopefully they did. All right, eventually. All right, let's look at the next one. The Feast of Weeks and Pentecost. This would be still in the spring festival time. The Feast of Weeks happens 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits is over. And that is because it is marked as the time when the wheat is harvested. So if we offered the first of the harvest of barley, then it makes sense that we also celebrate and offer the first of the harvest of wheat. Again, to remember that without it, without God's provision, we would have nothing. Pentecost, that Greek word Pentecost, literally means 50. So when we talk about Pentecost Sunday, that's really what that word means, 50. But obviously it means something so much more to us. So they receive an abundance, they offer it. There's tons of other things that they offer during the Feast of Weeks. As you can see, I've listed, it's a lot. The burnt offering alone, 7 lambs, 1 year old with no blemish, 1 bull, 2 rams, a grain offering, a drink offering, a food offering, a sin offering, a peace offering. And there's a lot of stuff going on. Because without barley and wheat, there are tons of things that the people of God cannot make to sustain them. So just a continuation of the fact that the land is full and produces significantly. And that's because of God. So these are essentially important to remember. This is a joyful time. There were fun times. You had feasts together. One of the reasons that so many things are sacrificed is because you ate together as much of a huge assembly as you could to celebrate the fact that God has provided more than you need. So that's why a lot of the sacrifice is so big.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
And you may have said this already, but does every family have to sacrifice all that, or is this the community?
It is the community. It is the community, yes, that sacrifices it. But it's a lot. So it's almost
that
like
is a lot.
when we get to the Feast of Booths. Well, when we get to the Feast of Booths, it's a lot. So to me, it's like everybody probably had to give a little something
Yep.
in. But no, this is as a community.
So
That's a great question.
So when people are pilgrimage
Uh-huh.
to Jerusalem.
Yes.
Okay, to attend, is this one of them that they?
Yes,
all of
it would be
them?
one of the ones that they would
So,
attend or try to, yes.
As a community, they are bringing all of this with them?
Yes, likely, yes. Yeah. You bring your sacrifice. And now, and this doesn't also, when you think about the fact that the people are coming to pilgrimage, they're probably also bringing their regular sacrifice to the temple, of a sin offering or a burnt offering or a praise and thanksgiving offering. Because if you lived far away, so say Dan is one of the furthest tribes from Jerusalem. So this is just an example. So say they've built spaces because it's obviously very difficult to get to Jerusalem every day. So God allowed them to create some spaces where they could bring some of those daily sacrifices. And they had priests in all the areas and all that kind of stuff. But you wanted to try to come to one of at least the big festival times. And if you did, you're going to probably try to bring your regular offerings also to the temple in Jerusalem, because you're going to be there. If you're pilgrimaging, you're probably going to be there weeks. So they're traveling with a ton of livestock that they're not going to be traveling back with nearly as much. And they're also bringing livestock and food that they're going to live off of as they camp outside of Jerusalem. So when you pilgrimage, you know, when you go on a trip for like a week and you got to think about all the things that you're packing, think about that. You got to bring all your food, you got to bring all your sacrifices, you got to bring probably a huge portion of your family and probably some slaves with you and servants and things like that. So this is a big deal, which is one of the reasons that families it was difficult to pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and they didn't do it very often. But they tried as much as they could. And if you lived closer, it was obviously easier for you. Yeah.
So weren't the priests also offering, or instead of where people could have offering, could buy offering there? That's what
Yes.
you just got upset with?
Yes, you could. Yes.
So especially the smaller offerings.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you could have bought a lamb. Obviously, Scripture records that you could buy doves and some other things within the temple. Yes, so, and most of those things were for the ones who pilgrimaged in, and it made it very difficult for them to travel with so much livestock. Or you just didn't have enough livestock, but you were trying to pilgrimage in anyway. So yes, so some people did buy.
If you think about it, the birds were meant to be for those who could not afford the larger animals. So that's, I think, another layer on top of what made Christ so angry, is these people already couldn't afford the sacrifice and were charging them for these birds. It was meant to be an alleviation of their burden. Yes.
Yeah.
So there's many layers to Christ's frustration there.
One of the other things about the Feast of Weeks, or what we understand the time to be as Pentecost now, was they brought offerings of 2 loaves of leavened bread. This is the only time that you ever brought leavened bread to the priest, because remember, leaven is considered to be, most of the time you wanted unleavened bread, but this is the only time that you brought leavened bread, and then they did an elevation offering with your leavened bread. And everything I've read just said it was because of the beauty of the offering. You had wheat. And so to make leavened bread was a unique and different kind of thing. So that's why. But this is the only festival where leavened bread is acceptable.
I thought leavening was considered evil.
There's 2 thoughts on that, and I would have to go back to my notes to really remember exactly. That was one aspect of it. And the other one, when it came to sacrifice, had to do with the 2 thoughts. So one was it's associated with sin, and we see that in the New Testament. And the other had to do with maybe because yeast is life, it's sort of like the blood. But I think in this case, because it's the celebration of the harvest, we're celebrating that we have all of this to give, and so we're kind of using our wheat to the ultimate extent that we use it, which is this full leavened loaf of bread, and it's offered as a wave offering at that. So.
Makes more sense than the definition that is evil.
Right, which is why there's
Yeah.
more than one school of thought there. We don't really know.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to the fall festivals, just briefly. So the fall festivals start in the 7th month, so this would be considered the second half of the year for the people of God. So the 7th month marks the end of harvest season and marks the beginning of the rainy season in their area. And so obviously the rainy season is what they need so that they can harvest again in the first part of the new year. And the rainy season goes from about October to March, and March, maybe the beginning of April, but really most of the time kind of early March is considered the dry, hot, rainy season. I'm sorry, the cold, rainy season. Okay, so we're going to start with the Feast of Trumpets, which really the Feast of Trumpets is a day, and then it marks a larger whole. The interesting thing about the fall festivals is together it lasts longer than the spring festival, and it lasts about a month, whereas the fall festival lasts about 2 weeks. So it cycles through a lot of Sabbaths. And the part of that reason is because of what it marks. So the trumpet, the Day of Trumpet, or the Festival of Trumpet, Feast of Trumpets, is really a day where they blow the shofar first thing in the morning, the ram's horn, as kind of a mark of this day. And it marks the end of harvest. That day marks the end of harvest day. It is also a reminder to live in such a way that God will honor his fidelity by providing the rains for the next harvest. So we're thanking God for the previous harvest. We're thanking him for the harvest to come and the fact that he will provide rain so that the harvest can grow. So you see how everything is marked by what God provides for them to be able to live. I think there's something very beautiful about that. It upholds the covenant to receive the blessing of God. In Israelite context, historically, a ram's horn was to summon Israel to break camp and embark on a mission that responds to God's call and requires God's presence for success. So when you read before they get into the Holy Land, anytime a ram's horn is blown, that's the idea. You break camp and you move forward knowing that God is going to provide whatever comes next. Now, obviously they're not breaking camp at this point, but they're still remembering that whatever comes next is God. That God provides, God responds, God is here, dwelling with them. So the beauty of the shofar being blown has taken kind of a new meaning and yet kept the old meaning as well. Okay, so on that day, it's a day of solemn rest. And if you'll notice, that day and the next day, which is the Day of Atonement, we have 2 days of solemn rest. 2 days where you are so focused on what God has done that you're not doing your job and you're trying not to do anything else but be connected to God. Now you come and you worship as a community and you bring the sacrifices and things like that, but these both are days where you are spending that whole time with no other distractions, if at all possible, no other distractions, so that you can be with God. Now, the Day of Atonement begins the evening of the 9th day, so at the end of the day of the Feast of Trumpet is when the Day of Atonement begins, and then it ends the evening of the 10th day. We've already talked really about the Day of Atonement, so I don't really know that there's much we need to say about that, except I want to point out 2 things that are spoken of in regard to the Day of Atonement that were not in the previous conversation about atonement. And those 2 things come from verse 29 and verse 30. And it says, "For anyone who does not practice self-denial during that entire day shall be cut off from the people." And verse 30 says, "If you do any work, such a one I will destroy from the midst of the people." So only in this particular day is there this kind of ordinance that to make sure that you do not do any work and that you are solely focused on this day. That shows the power and importance of this particular day. It is considered to be the most powerful and important festival day among the Israelites. All the others are very important. This one you do not mess with, you do not take lightly. And we've talked about a few weeks ago why that is. But you'll be cut off from the people, which basically means you'll be sent out, no longer community, or if you do any work, you will be destroyed in the midst of the people. So pretty severe punishments, but severe so it speaks to you of the importance. So take it seriously. Okay, the next one is the Feast of Booths. The Feast of Booths, I put on your page. It's the 15th day. It is 7 days long. The first day starts with a holy convocation, so no ordinary week work. They come, they build a booth, and they're supposed to stay in it for 7 days. The men are. Doesn't say the women or the families or anything like that. The men are to stay in it for 7 days. It is a reminder of where you have come from. Remember, these are to be celebrated. Majority of these are celebrated since they've taken the land. But the booth is a reminder of the fact that you used to live in slavery, you used to have nothing, and the fact that you lived in a tent for 40 years before you took the land. And now you have a home. Now you have land that's yours, your family's. So remember where you have come from, what God has done. So in some ways, you can be even more thankful for what you have now. So a very symbolic kind of thing. They really did kind of live in booths that they built. I also listed some of the sacrifices. This is an everyday of the 7 days. This is what sacrifice looked like pretty much every day. You brought the community, 13 young bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, a grain offering, a drink offering. Day 2, 14 young bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. Day 3 is like 10 bulls and 12 lambs. I mean, I would not want to be the priest. All I'm saying. Huh?
Who decides who's going to bring the lamb?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really don't know how that is decided. I do know, if you read chapter 27, I think it was, of Leviticus, when it talks about vows, and I think there's a little bit in chapter 26 too. Sometimes you dedicate animals to the temple, and sometimes you give animals to the priests and things like that in tithes. So my assumption is that some of that, those vowed animals probably are going to be used for sacrifice, the clean ones. But I don't know that it's all of them. So the assumption would be some of the wealthier families may be put in. Maybe the community as a whole. None of that was interestingly addressed in any of my commentaries of who pays for it, who brings it. Maybe there's a rotation. I don't know. But it is the community's responsibility to provide the sacrifices in whatever way. They need to have these sacrifices. So I don't know if they're like one short and Joe goes, I got one that I got a lamb so we can cover for the day or whatever. I just know it's the community's responsibility. So however they work it out.
None of this was done while they were here.
No, none of the only things that were continued to be practiced while they were in exile that were mandated to be practiced was Passover and the Day of Atonement. Yeah, you couldn't have done these. There was no harvest while they were still in the wilderness. So it even says, like, when you take the land, I think at the front part of chapter 23, these are the festivals that you do. So.
So on the surface, it looks like a good plan.
Yeah.
But, in reality, it can be very difficult to manage all of this because people being people, sometimes you get sick. How would you build a shelter, a booth if you fell ill? Or, what if your lamb suddenly died that you had planned to sacrifice? What happened?
Or he was lost on the journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Leave
What
the 99.
happened? In
Yeah.
reality,
Yeah.
You got a blemish on
stuff
the
happens
Yeah.
to people, and it's like, well, maybe I could understand why people kind of forgot.
Mm-hmm.
don't know if over here in chapter 26, it says penalties for disobedience.
I know.
That's pretty tough.
I mean, it was your fault, you got sick, you lost your lamb.
Well, and I think, with the patriarchy, I think, if the oldest male falls sick, it's going to fall to the next in line to carry out the duties. I mean, there were fail-safes in place for that kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, and you may have a lamb in reserve.
Had a dust storm. Just like stuff happens.
I get that. I get what you're saying, but it wasn't an option because these are sacred times that God is saying. I'm telling you to set them aside to remember. So it's part of the holy responsibility of the people of God. So dust storms, you sit in the booth in the dust, or the rain, or because it's a remembrance of sacrifice anyway. It's a remembrance of where you were before. If you can't build the booth, somebody else in your family needs to build the booth because that's part of your family,
Back in verse 30 of 23, when it says such a one, anyone who does any work during that entire day, such one I will destroy from the midst of the people.
Yeah.
Does that mean that somebody is going to destroy this person, or is he just going to be cast out?
I read a few commentaries.
Destroy him.
It said, I will.
Yes, I will destroy. That is God. That is God saying, I will deal with that person.
But didn't they stone her?
Well, I don't know. There's debate about what that definitively means. Does it mean that that they would be stoned by the community, or that God would strike them down? Obviously, we have a story in Leviticus where God strikes some people down, right? So He can do it.
But whenever there is a stoning, he's very clear about that also.
Yes, but there's a debate about which one happens because it's really not clarified, and some people, there's no doubt in everything that I read that the understanding is that person is put to death. Whether that death is by God directly or it is by the ordinance of the people stoning him. Now, I read another thing that talked about the fact that one of the things that we have to remember is that failure, let me read this because I pulled this directly out of a commentary that I thought was so good. The failure to cease from human labor in recognition of the rest that joins the community of God's rhythm of working and resting is a capital offense. So it puts the community and the world at risk in a way that is no less serious than taking another's life. So in that regard, I would lean towards stoning because it's a community. You have put the community in jeopardy by your failure to take seriously this very serious day. And remember, this is a day where they sacrifice these animals and lay their burdens and their sins upon them. So you should be taking very seriously the fact that this animal has bared your, is taking on your sins, and then there's another one that's sent out for the same reasons for you. So I think that's why if I'm doing whatever, being all lazy and whatever, and I kind of run into Marie, I've now kind of become a temptation for Marie. Marie, I'm not doing that. I'm not. I mean, I'll give him 30 minutes later on today. Well, then let's think about, Marie starts to go, well, I don't know if I need to give so much of my time and be so focused. I gave him like 3 hours this morning, that was pretty good. So then it starts to catch like wildfire. And then the whole community is not taking seriously the importance of this day. We have missed what God is doing right there for them. So I don't know if God strikes them down or if it's stoning. I really do kind of lean towards stoning because of what we've talked about before in regard to it is the community that suffers and the community that kind of has to participate by laying hands and, that kind of stuff. I don't know. That's a good question. I do know that it's very clear, though. A life is taken. The life is taken. Okay. Chapter 24. Let's move on. We're going to fly through it really quickly. It seems kind of out of step, maybe a little bit. We've already kind of talked about the lamp and the showbread. I think one of the reasons that it's placed where it's placed here is because we just got done talking about harvest times. And as I said before, the harvest times and what people bring to the temple for wave elevation offerings become what is largely used in regard to continuing to light the lamp of oil and to make the showbread that is placed in the holy place. So I think that's why they're mentioned again, particularly here. Then there's an interesting portion about a blasphemy, right? About this half Egyptian, half Israelite boy who gets in a fight with somebody and he blasphemies and the people have to stone him to death, right? And you're like, what does that have to do with the festivals, right? What does that have to do with anything? But I think there's something kind of deeper in here. And I think it goes back to remembering, even in the festivals, the holiness of God. So if you remember that, did we talk about blaspheming the name of God in
We talked about
Leviticus?
Yeah, we talked about the difference between. Oh gosh,
I know it's been a while.
just that it's a very specific, very deliberate action of like raising your fist and speaking specifically against God. This is no accident. You knew what you were doing. You knew what you were saying, and yes, that was 2 weeks ago.
So we've been talking about the holiness of God, remembering the holiness and the goodness of God within the festivals. Then there's this narrative that's placed in about this one person who apparently has thrown out the care for the holiness and provision of God, and he has taken the Lord's name and he has spoken against it. And because of that, what is considered is that blasphemy brings guilt on those who hear it as well as the one who bears it. Blasphemy is associated with taking life. And to speak against the holiness of God in such a blatant way is to kind of wish God dead, essentially. And we don't take life. God takes the life that he has created very, very, very seriously.
I think it's interesting that his name is not given, but his mother's name is.
Yeah, and nobody really wanted to, I was like, why is that? Why is that her name is listed? And no one touched it. No, nobody wanted to touch why his name wasn't given, but her name was.
She was the connection.
She was the Israelite.
She was the Israelite connection. I guess so.
Makes sense.
I guess
Maybe he
so.
was a minor.
Yeah. May have been. So blasphemy is considered to be a capital crime punished by death. And to kill one person is to eliminate one who is created in the image of God. That's why they lay hands on him. He made the choice, just as we talked about, I think it was last week, in regard to someone who chooses for themselves to sin and thus takes the guilt upon themselves, so that people have no blood guilt. So they lay it upon him, the guilt, any guilt that they may have for hearing the blasphemy, and then they have to stone him to death. There's lots of things that I read about blasphemy that I just thought were very interesting. What we learn here, and this is also the chapter where we talk about the eye for an eye and all that kind of stuff. What we learn here is that God outlines proportional punishment for physical injury. So why blasphemy here? It's seen as a grievous assault against God that is equivalent to murder. For God, sins against family and religion are the most serious, and hence often attract harsher penalties, whereas economic matters are treated more lightly, far different from other cultures of the time. It's the opposite in other cultures. In Mesopotamia, in Canaan, when you did something, a crime economically, the punishment was death. If you had a crime against your family of adultery or all kinds of other things, it was a much lesser penalty. Now God is switching them because of the value that he places upon a family unit and the fact that family is core to his people. When you make an act against your family, that's where the harsher punishment comes in, because family is so important to the people of God and to God. And life is obviously of great value to God. So the idea of blaspheming him is taking life. And just as it talks about an eye for an eye kind of things, there's just this idea of equivalency of what you take from someone or do to someone else. There should be an equivalent penalty and consequence response for it. So, so you don't have to take it as literally, but you can. If an eye is removed by me, if I just decide to just gouge out Marie's eye, the penalty for me of equivalent is essentially an eye would be taken from me. Because my punishment should be of the same value as what I have lost for Marie. So that's a lot of what this is here. Compensation was appropriate to the loss incurred and must be paid out. One of the other things is this applies to Israelites and aliens, and other residents who happen to find themselves within the Israelite community, specifically blasphemy, but also the equivalent of if you do something to someone, maim them, make it difficult for them to be able to take care of their family and the family unit, then your compensation, your consequence should be of same value. And I know there's lots of argument and conversation that can be had around this particular chapter, these particular things. We just don't have time to kind of go further than that. But that's why I think this interesting narrative is here. We've got the holiness and remembrance of God with the fact that this one guy casts out any care for God. And that's why it's in this place. It's a direct opposite of what God is asking of you.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. It's maybe an example of how we often will become very selfish in our actions. And it's like God's original intent here clearly is to say, don't do this because you're going to get punished. And then we get around to the time of Jesus when he's saying, don't take eye for an eye. He's saying, what you have done is you've said, oh, somebody has hurt me, now I'm entitled to go hurt them.
Yeah.
And I think if we relinquish our rights, our entitlement to retribution, that's what Jesus is calling us to.
Yeah.
And so God is trying to say, here, don't do it because it's bad, because it harms somebody.
Yeah.
And then Jesus flips that script even more and saying, and even if somebody does hurt you, you don't have a right now.
Yeah. 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 It's to take very seriously the care of other people, which we have seen so much in the book of Leviticus. Okay, moving on to chapter 25, we're going to fly through the Sabbath year. So in the midst of all of these rhythms for creation, God also creates these two very specific things. The Sabbath year, which is the 7th year of harvest, is considered to be a rest year for the land. So just as the people of God need to rest every Sabbath, and then we have some other times of remembering the goodness of God, the land needs an opportunity to also rest. God's creation needs to rest. And I think agriculturally, in some of the things that I read, it's really produces more for the land. It's good for the land sometimes to let it kind of sit and grow and then to reestablish. So there's another rhythm here for land. Now, God says in the midst of this, you can pick from what is grown for that year to live. It also says that anyone can pick from any of the vineyards. So this is definitely a year that is a huge plus for those who are more impoverished, for the poor among you. There's this beautiful, and we didn't talk about the gleaning law. I think it happens in here. I can't remember what chapter, that one little paragraph about the gleaning law. When you harvest, leave the droppings and the things like that. You don't go back if you miss something. That's for the poor and the widows in your community, that God has built in the way that we care for those who are having difficulty caring for themselves. So the year of Sabbath for the land is also another way where God cares for those who are struggling and have less, or for the alien in our midst, that kind of stuff. So, and for rest for the land. You can pick what you need, but we're not doing a huge harvest that we sell and all that kind of stuff and make money off of. We are just living for the base of what we need. Yes?
Is there special dispensation for those who have herds of cattle and sheep, etc.?
Yeah, so the scripture says that you will have everything you need for your whole family, for your animals, for everything that lives on your land that needs to eat. Enough will be provided. So very specifically within this year, there's a lot of trust that what grows without you pruning and, kind of doing some extra care to your lands and your harvest to make sure that it is an abundance, there's a lot of trust and faith that God is going to provide everything that you need. But again, this is another reminder of how God has provided. So Scripture says, God says, I will provide everything that everyone and everything of my creation needs. You just are not supposed to work the land. Just take what you need.
They didn't store it up.
No, it wasn't necessarily. Now, you may have had some stored from year 6 that you then eat into year 7, and that's considered to also be God's provision for the rest of the year. But you didn't store up anything else within year 7. You didn't harvest to store. You harvested just what you needed and what your family and your everything needed. It is just a year for the land to rest. It's beautiful. From that, we also have this thing called the Year of Jubilee. Now, the Year of Jubilee is a culmination of 7 cycles of 7 Sabbath years. 7. It really is kind of at the end of the 49th year into the 50th year. So they consider the Year of Jubilee to be the 50th year, every 50th year. It starts on the Day of Atonement, which I think is beautifully significant. By the blowing of the shofar. So on the Year of Jubilee, at the Day of Atonement, this extra thing happens of the shofar, which remember is that memory of God's presence and provision. You're going to have to remember that, because in the Year of Jubilee is this really beautiful thing that happens. The Year of Jubilee is a hugely celebratory year where those who have had to sell their land for some reason or another receive their land back, or maybe had to sell themselves into slavery because they were so impoverished, they get their freedom. So if I find myself in a place where I can't work my land anymore, I can't provide for my land or anything like that, then I'm going to have to sell it. Now, there's this beautiful thing that happens in the midst of it called a redeemer, a kinsman redeemer. Your hope is that if I have to sell my land for some reason, my hope is that my kinsman redeemer, which is my closest relative in this room, that's my mom. So my hope is that my mom buys my land and it stays in the family for the amount of years until the Year of Jubilee. And then I'll get to still live on my land and work my land, but essentially kind of belongs to my mom. And then in the Year of Jubilee, she hands it all back to me. So I have kind of been an indentured servant to her. I've lived on the land, but she may have she'll probably get the profits for those amount of years, unless I can buy it back from her before the Year of Jubilee. If I can't, then on the Year of Jubilee, it comes back to me beautifully. I don't have to pay anything else or anything like that. It is just returned to me. If I had to sell myself for some reason, the first person I'm hoping is going to buy me is my mom. Because the call of family is so important that the first right of refusal and the first person that should answer the call to help a family member who is in need is is the next kin for you. The beautiful kinsman redeemer. And if you've read the book of Ruth, there's a beautiful story about a kinsman redeemer. And it goes further and further and further. So if my mom can't buy me, then hopefully my aunt can, or my uncle. We're talking in female portions, but it's really the male. Or, down the line. And if nobody else in my family can help me, then my land or my servanthood or anything like that goes to somebody else in this room who can afford me. But in the year of Jubilee, I'm released from slavery, or my land is returned to me. Done deal. I don't have to pay anything extra. It is given to me. I have done my servanthood or all that kind of stuff. Now, the chapter also talks about if before the year of Jubilee I rack up enough money that I can buy my land back, I will. And then there's some stuff about some however many years before the Jubilee or anything like that. There's like interest put in or that kind of stuff. But on the year of Jubilee, I don't have to do any work or pay anything. I receive it back, free and clear. Well, maybe. And I may not be there anymore.
Yeah.
But my kids get my land back.
Yeah. Inheritance.
It is inherited then back to my family line, to my Baytob family tree. Okay? No matter who so if mom passed away, she held my land, and mom passed away, whoever's next in line at her house is holding it. But they still have to give it back to my line, to me. So, because the family core is important. Now, part of the reason for the year of Jubilee is that when God sends them into the promised land, every family gets a portion. Is it equal? I think to the extent that God could make the land equal to everyone, yes. Sometimes people have to sell off land or they sell themselves. The year of Jubilee restores back an equality among the Israelite people. So Marie doesn't have 8 lands now because they all got sold and Marie bought them. And I have none. And my family line now has nothing for the rest of generations. And Marie's continuing to make more money and more money and more money and more money and whatever else. This is to keep the equality of the people of God. So no one feels they can rise above and have more. It's beautiful. I mean, it's this beautiful idea that everyone of God's people is equal, and that God is the one that gave you the land. And God is the one that created you, and your land has value to you and your family. But it's yours from God. So no one can hold it for eternity from you. So that's the beautiful intent of the year of Jubilee. It's amazing. Now, as far as I can understand, and a lot of other people that I read can understand, there is no proof that the year of Jubilee ever actually was celebrated, unfortunately. Some people say there is a possibility, but it is extremely difficult within the Word of God to find proof. Now, there's some external things that some people have suggested, maybe suggest that the people of God really did celebrate the year of Jubilee and do what it said, but it's kind of vague. And to me, and what Marie and I talked about, is like, for such a significant thing, don't we think we would have found it in the Word of God somewhere? Like, it would be recorded and found within our structured book.
Don't you think that those that had profited from buying the land that they're rather discouraged it from that 50th year was approaching?
Yeah.
Missed the point.
Yeah.
They did the complete opposite of what was the intent anyway. Yes. So it is a beautiful wish that it had transpired, but I really do not know if it did.
It seems to me like because if all the other jubilees were not done as God appointed for them to be done,
Yeah.
the people were destroyed.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they didn't.
If they had trouble remembering everything else, maybe they forgot.
I mean, every 50 years is a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a lot.
Yeah. Now we know portions of obviously portions of the law in regard to kinsman redeemers and things like that did transpire. But the actual living out of the year of Jubilee, we just don't have, there's just no solid proof that it really happened, that they really lived into that. Which I don't know, I just wish we did. I wish it maybe had. And maybe it did, and we just don't have any knowledge of it. Okay, flying through chapter 26 and 27. Chapter 26 is the blessings and the curses. It's a normal chapter that ends. Remember, this is largely a legal document, covenant language between the people of God and God. And so legal documents like this would end with a blessings and a curse. This is kind of regular format culturally. So there are blessings. If you live into this covenant and do all the things that I'm asking of you as my vassal, then here are all the amazing blessings. And the blessings just go like this. There's going to be good harvest. There's going to be rain, so there's good harvest. There's going to be peace, and God's presence will dwell with you. And there's this beautiful thing that it says kind of at the end of the blessings, that God will walk with his people. And it's a reference back to when God walked with his people in Eden. Freedom right next to him. If you will live and abide by the law, if you will obey and move towards holiness and seek me, then things will be amazing for you. You will live in a land that will continue to provide for you. You will have everything that you need. You won't, if armies come towards you of other people, I will protect you, and you will always win. There will be no doubt. And I will be with you more intimately than I have been before we left, when we left the garden. So these are the blessings. But if you don't obey and follow and seek holiness, and there's the rest of the chapter, which is a lot longer than the blessings, right? The curses were longer and really depressing. It is also normal that the curses portion will be longer than the blessings portion within a legal document. So there are 5 general curses. There's general warnings, which is just kind of all kinds of stuff. There's drought and poor harvest, wild animals, war, God's abandonment, war, and exile, kind of the last portion. And all of the things that God says kind of falls into that. And he uses this phrase over and over again of sevenfold, because we know that 7 is kind of a holy number for God, a day of completion, a number of completion. So this idea of it's going to come to you sevenfold is this much more powerful idea of the fact that you have breached covenant. And you're going to get the opposite of what the blessings were. Instead of rain, you get drought. Instead of no war, there's going to be a ton of war. And I don't know about you, but in reading the curses portion, I was like, well, that happened, and that happened, and that happened, and that happened. So, I mean, God held to his covenant because the people of God could not hold to the covenant. So the curses that he says will transpire, they transpire. They're in the Old Testament, pretty much the next book on. So he does what he says. And yet, at the very end, there's this beautiful few verses of hope. And I hope you got that. This promise of restoration, yet grace. If you'll turn back to me, if you will seek me again, essentially, then I will remember you and I will restore you. I'll bring you back to the land. I'll remember you in captivity. And I will restore my people, and I will walk with you again. I will dwell with you again and be with you again. And the beauty is that we know that that is also what God follows through on. And Isaiah records it, and Nehemiah records it when the people of God returned back to the land that was destroyed because of their sin. And God remembers them. And the whole New Testament records it, that God remembers his people, if we'll but turn back. Okay, so briefly, this last chapter. What? We should have ended in blessings and curses, but there's this one final seemingly strange chapter that talks about vows. And I think the reason that it is listed here is because one thing that God recognizes is that sometimes when we get in desperate places and we've made bad decisions, sometimes we make vows of, God, if you'll just do this, I'll do this. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one that's probably had those moments. God, if you just hear me right now and help me with the situation and do this, I will do X, Y, Z. And then later on, I'm like, I'm not sure I want to do X, Y, Z, you know? So this chapter kind of also comes about the fact of when you make a vow, which is a vow to God, which is like a covenant to him, you should take it seriously. And if you happen to make a vow and then you kind of want to renege on it in some way, shape, or form, you realize that the vow you made was something that you cannot fulfill, that you made in haste. Here are some ways that you can make retribution in regard to the vow you made. And some of that was in regard to if I vow myself to the sanctuary and then I realize I probably can't vow myself because I got to take care of my family, can't leave my family and go work within the temple, then I should pay a price because I made a vow. So I pay the sanctuary. As well as the fact of the vow was taken care of by the priests. So they really don't need me, but I made a vow to dedicate myself. So I should just pay a price. And the price was the considered slave price at the time. This is a lot of money. Because this is the money that is listed here is really a whole lot more than you would typically pay a daily worker. So this is a significant amount of money. So it's a reminder that a vow that you make is very important. So think before you make a vow to God, because if you go back on it, there are some things that need to get taken care of. Otherwise, you are out of relationship. You've made a distant relationship and caused some issue between you and God. The rest of the chapter really just talks about if you vow an animal or if you vow an unclean animal, you can vow lands or dedicate lands or houses, all that kind of stuff. Like there are some things you can dedicate. Obviously, we know the story of Hannah dedicates her son to the Lord. And she follows through in her vow. She keeps her vow. She brings her son, and she dedicates him for the service of the temple. But if I want to dedicate my Eli, and then I want to take it back because I will miss him and things like that, and I realize that I can't do that, then there are some things I need to do to take care of that. A vow is very important. There are 3 things that you cannot vow with, and I'll be finished with this. You can't vow with a firstling. Firstborn animal of any sacrificial sort. They're already God's, so you can't vow that to God. It's already His. You can't give God what's already His in some ways. Unclean animals can be vowed, so if they're firstborn and they're unclean. Things devoted to destruction or things that are already set apart for God, those things you can't vow. They already have a purpose. And then tithes. You can't vow a tithe. I can't say, well, I'm going to give you my 10% that I'm already supposed to be giving you, right? Like that's already God's as well. So I can vow something on top of my tithe, but the tithe already belongs to God, that specifically. So those are things that you can't vow. And so that is the last chapter of Leviticus and how we end the book of Leviticus. So Marie has something real quick, and then I think we'll be done. That's it.
Just to kind of wrap this up, the question of where do you go from here? We thought the New Testament was a really great place to go with this, and I just made for you references in the New Testament to Leviticus. This is not all of them, and there are 44 here. It's not all of them. this is either direct quotations in Leviticus in the New Testament, or it's references to ideas that come from Leviticus, like about the priesthood and sacrifices and that kind of thing. And I left a really important one out as I went back through the list thinking it was there. I realized it wasn't. So if you want to write on the very bottom, Matthew chapter 5, 18 through 20. And that is where Jesus talks about coming to fulfill the law, but does not abolish the law. Not one letter, not one iota passes from this law, but he fulfills it. And that's one thing Becky and I wish we could have gotten a lot more into, is what it looks like for Jesus to fulfill the law. And we're just out of time. But that's one that I accidentally left off. And then Matthew chapter 5. 18 through 20. Matthew chapter 5, 18 through 20. And then really, another one you could add on is Matthew chapter 5, verse 48, where Jesus talks about God is perfect and you as his people should strive for perfection. It echoes, be holy as I am holy. So Matthew 5:48 and Matthew 5:18 through 20. And you'll see that at one point I finally stopped writing out the verses and just started doing a list. And oh, by the way, just the entire book of Hebrews is a reference to the law. And so from here, in the spring, Becky and I would like to unpack the book of Hebrews as kind of a New Testament response to Leviticus. I can't believe I'm agreeing to this.
But y'all did such a nice show.
Well, thank you. So we haven't set a specific start time, but we know Thursdays at 10 a.m. starting in the spring. We're shooting for 12 weeks.
The spring or the fall?
The spring.
We're going to need some time.
This is going to take a little while. We are going to look at the book of Hebrews as something of a New Testament response to the law. So book of Hebrews in the spring. And oh, by the way, just as a side note, Sandy Richter is releasing Jonah in August.
Yay.
Yay, I love that. I love that. So, yes.
What was this? You said chapter 5, 18 through 20.
18 through 20, and then Matthew chapter 5, verse 48.
Oh, 48.
And by the way, September 19th
September 19th.
is when Becky will begin Jonah. Thursdays, 10 a.m., beginning September 19th.
Again, what?
A Jonah study.
What day?
That's a Thursday.
Thursdays at 10.
Thursdays at 10 a.m., September 19th.
Don't worry, we'll
definitely
do
offer
more
Jonah
than
again.
once. We're
Yeah.
probably going to lead Epic of Eden again soon.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? I don't know we can answer them all. Things we didn't get to, burning questions. I know what time it is, but
And if you have input for us to help us to develop this a little bit more, I think at some point we're probably going to teach Leviticus again,
We know-
a longer portion. So any thoughts you have about some things we need to spend more time on, then we would love input of that too. So, and it doesn't have to be now, but.
any questions about either today or previous weeks? Burning questions?
We're going to have this on video.
We do thank you.
You're welcome. It's online.
It's online. Yeah, it's on the Trinity website.
Trinity website under media, you'll find it under there. And if anybody's watching this later and they want to see some of the references that we've passed out, you can email us and we'll email them back to you.
I can include them.
Kyle can include them.
And I just want to add one more thing. While we've been studying the book of Leviticus, I've been reading through this book called The Gospel According to Leviticus. And I'm telling you, it's such a great book. And for me, it was very essential while digging through all of this Old Testament stuff to read this in context of how Leviticus plays out in regard to Jesus. It's a really quick, easy read. It's 160 pages by a guy named David Callis. It is a phenomenal book. So if you like to read and you want to read just a little bit more about Leviticus in regard to Jesus, it's a great book to read. So I highly recommend it because I like to recommend books.
Anything else? All right. I will close this in prayer.
Perfect. Heavenly
Heavenly Father, I give you thanks once again for this wonderful group of people and this incredible book of the Bible. God, I pray that each of us walks out of here with a brand new understanding of just how holy you are. God, that we would understand you on a new level and that it would permeate every aspect of our lives, from how we worship you to how we talk about you to how we relate to your Son. God, I pray that we will share this with everyone around us, that we will try our best each day to walk with you so that you will be our God and we can be your people. God, we just want to be in relationship with you. So draw us in and don't let the education stop here. I pray, God, that we would all continue to dig into your word and to share what we learn with those around us. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.